Ladies and gentlemen, it is Thursday night in Philadelphia, and the world is as complicated as ever. So let's talk about it. Welcome to the October 2019 edition of Geopolitics with Granieri, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. I'm Ron Granieri, director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, your host and moderator of tonight's discussion. It is a pleasure to have you all here with us, either on the internet or live here tonight on October 24th, 2019 at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. It's a pleasure to have you here. A little over 2 years ago, in October 2017, Syrian Democratic Forces, supported by a U.S.-led international coalition, declared victory in a months-long battle to take the Syrian city of Raqqa, the capital of the self-proclaimed Caliphate created by the Islamic State, or IS. The fall of Raqqa concluded a campaign to destroy the physical caliphate, which IS, profiting from the chaos of the Syrian civil war, had proclaimed in 2014. The caliphate offered both supporters and enemies of IS a vision for the future that challenged previously held notions of the relationship of extremism to the international state system. Although jihadists had proclaimed for years an ultimate desire to establish their ideal religious state, IS was the first to immanentize the eschaton. IS both attracted sympathizers from around the world to help build their state and encouraged those unable to make the physical journey to declare their support by engaging in acts of violence from Berlin to Brussels to Boston. Caliphate propaganda built upon a narrative of continuous success and expansion, so its gradual shrinkage and physical defeat marked a crucial turning point in the story of IS and in the larger story of jihadist extremism. The threat has changed, but it has not evaporated. For even if the caliphate is no more, its ideas and adherents still exist and continue to pose real threats to anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim, in the Middle East or anywhere who does not share its ideology. The recent American declaration of victory against IS has led to an equally unilateral announced intention to withdraw from the region, all of which has thrown open even more questions about the international response to IS, its relationship to its estranged sibling Al-Qaeda, and to what, if anything, remains of the global war against terror. Our guest tonight, Colin Clarke, has studied IS for years. In his new book, After the Caliphate, Dr. Clarke offers insights into why IS succeeded, what its apparent defeat might mean, and how the U.S. should proceed in the future. So how can the history of the Caliphate help us to understand what will come next? How will IS change its tactics without a physical center? Will that change its relationship to Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups? And what does American withdrawal from northern Syria mean in all this? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation tonight with our guest, Dr. Colin P. Clarke. Dr. Colin P. Clarke is a senior fellow in FPRI's program on national security and an assistant teaching professor in the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University, with a variety of connections to other centers that study terrorism in the United States and abroad. A PhD in international security policy from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, Dr. Clarke has testified before Congress and presented at a range of international security forums, including working as an analyst with Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Shafafiyat at ISAF headquarters in Kabul, Afghanistan, working for Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. Widely quoted and published in media outlets and scholarly journals, Clarke is, in addition to After the Caliphate, also the author of Terrorism Incorporated, The Financing of Terrorism, Insurgency, and Irregular Warfare, and Terrorism, The Essential Reference Guide. One of the United States' leading young scholars of terrorism, we are delighted to have him with us tonight. Welcome, Colin Clarke.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So, Colin, comparing IS now to where things were 6 years ago, say, should we be happy about how things have gone?
Yeah, I think in some ways we should be very happy, right? This is a group that rose up out of the ashes of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It formed a caliphate, one that had governance capabilities. It spread throughout the Middle East and North Africa and then further afield, right, establishing franchise groups and affiliates as far as Southeast Asia. And if you look at the group now, it's a shell of its former self. I think, we've made tremendous progress, and without getting too far ahead of ourselves, I think it's one of the main reasons I'm so concerned. To borrow a sports analogy, we're at the 10-yard line, and we're basically taking our ball and going home. Right, the fight is not over, and we're withdrawing our forces right at a time where we should be, essentially trying to seal this.
Well, and that whole question of what does it mean to say that we've won? What have we won? I want to take this in two parts. So the first part is, the defeat of the conquest of Raqqa is certainly a victory of sorts.
No question.
And to what should we attribute that victory? Was it a matter of international pressure? Was it a matter of the fighting elan of the local forces that were against IS? Was it a matter of weaknesses within the caliphate itself?
Multifactorial, to be sure.
Yeah.
It was the U.S. military, by and large, right? American military power, which is still alive and well, despite what a lot of people will tell you. It was ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It was working by, with, and through local partners like the Kurds, training, equipping, and assisting host nation forces on the ground to do a lot of the hard fighting. If you look at the numbers, the Kurds lost 11,000 fighters, right, fighting against IS. And then the broader international community played a role. One of the main pillars of my research over the past several years has been looking at IS financing in particular. And so within the broader global coalition to defeat ISIS, or Daesh, the Arabic acronym, the counter-ISIS finance fight was quite a big one. And it's one where I saw a lot of collaboration between the public and private sector, right, between international institutions, global banks, and then think tanks like the RAND Corporation, where I worked for 10 years and did a lot of the kind of nitty-gritty data analysis at a fairly granular level, looking at trends in IS financing. This was the richest terrorist group ever known. Was making $1 million a day just from oil alone at one point. So,
and who were they selling the oil to?
That's a great question. The oil was going to the Assad regime, so they're actually selling to their enemy. It was making its way into Turkey through middlemen and cutouts and all sorts of front companies. It was going to finance the caliphate itself. So unlike Al-Qaeda and a lot of other terrorist groups that relied on external state sponsorship, IS was unique because it raised its funds locally and it spent its funds locally. It was self-sustaining in that respect. Oil and oil-related products, the smuggling and trafficking, were one piece of that. I mean, a fairly significant piece. But they also made money from extortion, taxation, smuggling antiquities, slavery. Right? I mean, this is a pretty barbaric group, and I kind of opened that talking about the rape of Yazidi women in this. This was crimes against humanity. These were war crimes. And so I think it's another reason why I'm very concerned right now that, in my opinion, this group is being given the space to resurge in parts of Syria and parts of Iraq as well.
You mentioned the relationship that they may have even been selling oil to the Assad regime. Yeah. What is the connection between the rise of the caliphate and the Syrian civil war?
In my opinion, it's one of the two major factors that led to the rebirth of ISIS. You had the United States pulling out in earnest right around 2011 from Iraq, kind of despite facts on the ground suggesting that it was probably not the best move. At the same time, you had the Syrian civil war, which was creating a power vacuum that IS largely filled. Couple that with what was going on in Iraq with the Maliki regime, right? The highly sectarian nature of Iraqi politics, that pushed a lot of Iraqi Sunnis to IS, and it was kind of a perfect storm of sorts that allowed this group to resurge, take hold of, major cities like Mosul and Raqqa, and start building the contours of what ultimately became the caliphate.
We've talked about ISIS before on this program, as a matter of fact. It seems like over the past 5 years there have been several books on the subject, and A few years back, we had Will McCants on here talking about his
big
book
fan of
about
Will
ISIS.
McCants.
Great book, right?
Yeah.
And at the time, so this would have been 2015, we were talking about ISIS. And at the time, the phenomenon was that by seeking to create the concrete location of the caliphate, that this made ISIS a unique threat and uniquely different from other jihadist organizations. Does the defeat or does the collapse of the caliphate, right, does this just is ISIS now a terrorist organization or extremist organization like any other? Or does the fact that they did succeed once give them special cachet going forward?
Sure. So that's a great question. Loaded question. I think there's a couple of different threads there. Creating the caliphate itself was a monumental achievement. It's something that Al-Qaeda said it always wanted to do, but wasn't able to do. IS said it wanted to do it. It accelerated the timeline, and it did it, right? It drew in tens of thousands of foreign fighters from 80 different countries, including from countries that we don't normally associate with global jihad, countries like Chile and Cambodia, right? You had foreign fighters, both natural-born Muslims, but also converts traveling with their families in many cases, as we see now, with kind of Al-Hol and the women and children that are kept there, 70,000 in all, right, to this corner of the globe to create the caliphate. But it was a double-edged sword because it also painted a target on their back, right? It gave us a place to actually attack, right, with artillery and air power and et cetera. So I think in many ways, to me, I knew the caliphate was never going to last in perpetuity, right? It's just not something that the United States or the West more broadly would stand for. It was a matter of, when, not if, in my opinion. But at the same time, and I wrote a piece for FPRI with my colleague and friend Hararo Ingram, where we talked about the ISIS nostalgia narrative. If you actually go and look at their propaganda now, which, that's an unfortunate quirk of my job, is that I consume a lot of jihadi propaganda, right? I'm looking at this stuff day in and day out, trying to observe different trends and patterns. They're already hearkening back to the caliphate. They're saying, look, brothers, sisters, everyone who made hijrah to come and join us, this has been taken away from you. We did it, and the filthy Americans destroyed it, and they killed women and children in the process, right? And so just the fact that they established it in the first place is a monumental achievement. There's no question about it. The flip side of that, or maybe just related to that, is the virtual element, right? That with the internet, that with cyberspace, this caliphate is now going to be propagated and live on message boards, in chat rooms, right? And so it's different than in the past where once you destroyed something physically, it went away, right? And you kept an eye on it and made sure that it didn't grow back. Here, it's a bit more decentralized, right? There's a virtual element to it.
Now, in much of the discussion about the war in Syria, we know that the Syrian regime and their Russian partners often
and Iranian.
And the Iranians, right? But they emphasize the struggle against ISIS as it allowed them to sort of fold all Sunni opposition to the Syrian regime and call it all ISIS. Now that the caliphate has been destroyed, or at least in its current form, in its previous form, how is the sort of the rhetoric of the fighting in Syria going? Right? Is this still a matter of ISIS is presented at all Sunni rebels against the Syrian regime are ISIS, and so therefore that gives everybody carte blanche to
when convenient, right? So we've seen some ideological flexibility on the part of the Assad regime, right? When it's beneficial to Assad for ISIS to be the bad guys, they're the bad guys. When it's beneficial for him to look the other way, he looks the other way. The propaganda that I've been looking at a lot lately has actually been Russian propaganda over the last 2 weeks, and it's really interesting to see how RT, Russia Today, is portraying the U.S. withdrawal. There's a couple of pieces. There was one video where U.S. troops were driving past Syrian regime troops, and it was on RT Today, and it was basically mocking the U.S., saying, I wonder if they waved on their way home. Or there was another one where a Russian soldier was taking a selfie at a recently evacuated Special Forces base, essentially saying, let's go see how the Americans lived. Let's see what they ate. Look, there's still food on the table. They retreated, and really painting this as something where the United States should not be trusted as a reliable partner in the region. I mean, they've gotten a lot of mileage out of that. And there's something to it, right? I mean, the Kurds are saying the same thing. I think a lot of people in our own SF community, feel that way. And so we didn't need any more PR bad PR in the region,
Right.
but this is a pretty hefty dose of that.
I mean, it is paradoxical, right? Because the Russians certainly, up until 2 weeks ago,
When the Russians are looking good in a PR battle, something's gone wrong.
This is a problem, right?
Something's gone terribly wrong.
Something's gone terribly wrong.
This
because
is we're the home of Madison Avenue, and we can't figure out.
we should be
right,
we should
how to
be better
square
at this than that.
Yeah.
Huh? Well, yeah, because the idea that the Russians for so long, right, they wanted to present the presence of the Americans as sort of warmongering and helping ISIS.
Sure.
But now that the United States is withdrawing, now the United
Tail
States is
between their
weak and
legs.
cowardly and
Exactly.
running away.
They're quite good, for all the Russians' fault. They are very good at recognizing our missteps and capitalizing on them. I mean, I testified last year about jihadism in the Caucasus and thought a lot about Russia. And I think in this country we have a tendency to look at Putin as 10 feet tall, right? I just think the Russians do a lot of stuff. I call it the kitchen sink approach. They throw a lot of stuff against the wall. Some of it sticks, and that's what we focus on, right? If you look at the return on investment from election meddling, it's a pittance compared to what we spend on F-35s and all these other things. But the mileage they got out of it was tremendous.
Tremendous. And we are still struggling with this question, right? Is what was our presence in Syria about all along, and what does it mean? Because if the argument is, well, we want to put an end to forever wars, or if the argument is we wanted to defeat ISIS, we've defeated ISIS.
Right. Because we said so.
Because we said so. Because we announced that this because if you define the enemy in a particular way, you can define the enemy's defeat in a particular way. But there is a difference between what we may say and what is actually true on the ground. And how do we manage the difference between the two?
Look, if we're ending endless wars, why did we just move forces to protect oil wells? Why are the troops that were in Syria just being shifted to Iraq? And why are we sending 2,000 new troops to Saudi? I just got back, as you know, from the Middle East. I was there all last week.
Right.
And so being in the Gulf and listening to conversations there and hearing, we like to overlay everything with sectarianism. And no doubt, that's a big part of it, right? The Sunni-Shia divide is real. You throw the Kurdish element into the mix, ethnic conflict and sectarianism undergirds a lot of what we see today. But sometimes it's strategic incoherence on our part, right? It's this very impulsive nature. If you look at the background to how we made the decision, a strong man in Turkey convinced our president to make a decision that most of the foreign policy and national security community disagrees with. And then it's, I kind of like fear waking up every morning and looking at the news because you really don't know what to expect. And this is a major monkey wrench in a U.S. security policy. This isn't a minor thing.
It is a very big thing. But here's a question related to that has been on my mind because there's a recent essay by the director of our Middle East program at FPRI, Aaron Stein.
Sure.
Talks about one of the problems with this whole situation is while one can criticize the president's decision, and Aaron does, and you do, and I do, that this should...
And let me be clear, this isn't being political.
Oh,
this
no.
is criticizing
this is
policy, not the person.
That's right. So it's a strategic decision. But it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And the president has made pretty clear that he wants to do this. And we know that Secretary Mattis essentially left office in part because he was disagreed about Syria, even though the president stepped back from making a policy change then.
December.
And so when we try to think about the decisions made in the United States and the implications thereof, Aaron suggests, and I think it's an interesting argument, that part of that one can criticize the president for being impulsive, perhaps. But if a guy does on an impulse something he has been saying for over a year that he wants to do, then shouldn't the people who would be responsible for carrying out that policy have been better prepared for the day when his impulse would become reality? Could we have handled this? Could the American military, could American policy been handled differently to make it seem less haphazard?
But what if it's a disastrous decision to begin with? Are we infantilizing him by taking away, the significance of that? If you look at the way the National Security Council has been gutted, there's no process to the decisions. I can disagree with someone's decision and still understand why they made it or still respect it.
Right.
But if you are just kind of willy-nilly going around the world and kind of making decisions without I teach a course at Carnegie Mellon called U.S. Grand Strategy. all we do is study the history of U.S. foreign policy and decision-making, and folks like Hal Brands and other scholars, are largely critical of the president. Look, there's some things that I think the president's doing right. People want to paint me as a Trump basher. I like that he's getting tough with China. There are some things that I think are positives, but it's the kind of, like I said, the incoherence that troubles me as a scholar of foreign policy, and not explaining, right, not being transparent, and kind of walking through the process of why you did this and where it's going to get us.
Which, of course, brings us to the problem of, or the question of the Kurds.
Sure.
For the audience, for the purpose of our discussion, what was the Kurdish contribution to the defeat of the Caliphate?
A major one. I mean, we would not have defeated the Caliphate, make no mistake, without the Kurds. Or if we did, it would take maybe a decade longer. So I think, as far as a trusted, effective fighting force on the ground, that was it for us. That was the only game in town. They acquitted themselves quite well. And so now having the Kurds moved over to the Assad regime, I don't know how you move forward. I think in whatever happens next in Syria, and this is probably it. This is probably sealing the win for Assad, right? And don't forget, this is someone that uses chemical weapons on his own population, including children, right? So think about who is back in charge of this country. The Iranians now have the potential for a strategic land bridge, right, stretching across the region, which they can use to resupply their proxy forces with all sorts of different, weaponry, including pretty high-tech missiles, and then the Russians as well. Although, everyone says Putin is this grand chess master, I also feel, to play devil's advocate, a little bit like, be careful what you wish for. Okay, you won Syria. Now you have Syria. This is a country still mired in a civil war, so good luck. The Russians aren't really known for post-conflict stability and reconstruction. They can break things. They're not that good at putting them back together.
The problem is you could chase the car all you want, but when you catch it, what do you do with it? Right now? Well, and this, of course, leads to the other regional player who's important in all this, and that is Turkey.
Sure.
And the complicated relationship is Turkey had set itself up as an opponent of both ISIS and the Assad regime. But at the same time, Turkey is a violent opponent of Kurdish autonomy in the region. So how do we understand Turkey's decision at this point to put the pressure on the president for the United States to pull out of the region, to essentially give them a green light to try to crush the Kurds or to drive them out of this region? Is it that they've decided that IS is weak enough that now they can move on to what's more important to them, which is defeating the Kurds?
Look, I think it's also a false narrative to say that the Turks have been actually fighting IS as robustly as they claim to. What about the jihadi highway, right? It's part of the legacy of having a conflict like Turkey has with the Kurds. No matter how much you see, an emerging threat, you're still locked in on the group you fought a 30-year bloody insurgency against.
Correct.
That's the legacy of conflict.
So nothing is really going to be more important to Turkey than fighting the Kurds.
And everybody knows that. And to me, if you're Erdogan, why not? I look at the Turks as they got everything that they want. They got to extend the safe zone 20 miles into northern Syria. They're sending back. They plan to send back Syrian refugees, from Turkey into Syria. Sanctions have been lifted, right? And they got a green light to go attack the Kurds. So what did they lose? I don't know.
Because they're not particularly worried or threatened by IS.
There's been some attacks on Turkish soil. There was the Reyna nightclub attack. There was another attack in and around Gaziantep. But look, the Turks are highly capable security forces. They can take care of themselves, and I think they know exactly what they're doing. We've seen them play footsie with ISIS. We see them doing the same thing with a basket of rebel groups in and around Idlib province, right, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other kind of Al-Qaeda-linked, quasi-Al-Qaeda-linked rebel groups. That to me, to be on a fly on the wall in Sochi, to listen to that, of course, with a translation headset, listen to what was being said
very,
between
very small translation headset
Erdogan and Putin, because I kind of expected joint patrols, the Russians in Manbij, all of these, or Kobani rather, all of these other developments. But I want to know what they said about Idlib, because to me, that's where my attention now swings, which is an area where you've got groups like Hurriyet al-Din and HTS bottled up, and what happens next? That's the kind of last bastion of rebel governance in the country now.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to turn to the audience, so I'll give you a chance to all warm up with a question of your own. When I turn to the audience to ask questions, remember, we will have a microphone, so a microphone will be brought to you, raise your hand, and the first question goes to someone who has never asked a question at Geopolitics with Granieri before. So you can think about that while I turn to Colin and I ask you this. So related to this issue of moving on to other rebel-held areas, what about the problem of refugees and foreign fighters that are unleashed by the current changes? What should the policy of states in the region, in the world, be about people who are leaving the caliphate and say they want to come home?
So I feel really strongly about this, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to. I'm a big proponent that states should take their citizens home.
All right.
I understand, I'm not naive, there are a lot of challenges, particularly in Europe, right? So I'm a fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague, was lucky enough to spend the whole month of June there, know the folks there quite well and the challenges that they face, as well as the kind of lay of the land in terms of capabilities of the intel and security forces and the judiciaries, right? Because that's a big component of this.
Sure.
If we bring these people back, will we have enough evidence to prosecute them? We struggle with battlefield evidence, including digital evidence, right? So if you have social media of someone committing a crime, right, will that hold up in a court of law in Europe, right? And if it does, even if it does, what's the penalty, right? How punitive? Is it a 2-year sentence? Is it a 4-year sentence? Right. And then you're struggling with this whole issue of radicalization and de-radicalization.
Because there's a problem, right? They're not going to vanish, right? These people are either going to be there or they're going to go home.
Right. So, I think it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? I think it's trading short-term problems for much longer-term persistent issues. And I think the current stance, which is letting them rot there, is myopic, frankly. And so, again, not being naive about the challenges involved, I think it is incumbent upon states to bring them home. Now, you have the issue like we saw the other day with a bunch of Dutch women in one of the camps suing, the Netherlands, saying, if you don't take us back, so there it's like, that makes me want to swing my sympathy to the other side of like, no, you left and you joined a terrorist group, suffer the consequences, right? But we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Life is not this binary thing where it's black or white, and we have to look and be smart about, kind of squaring that circle and doing the best we can to bring these people back, because if they're stateless, right, what state are they going to join? The Islamic State.
Islamic State.
Right? This is just fodder for this group to kind of bring in new recruits.
Right. Fair enough. Good. Well, I have many more questions, but I'm sure you do too. So is there a question from the audience for Dr. Clarke? Yes, right here. The microphone's going to come right to you, and speak directly into it for the recording, and go right ahead.
Hi, could you speak about the implications of the recent developments on Israel?
Specifically?
The potential to harm Israel with the Syria, Russia, and Iran in particular having access or better access?
Sure, yeah. So I think that is a major implication, one that actually I'm surprised I haven't seen more about. We've got a piece coming out tomorrow. I'm a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center in New York City, and so we've got a piece analyzing the recent situation in Syria, and we talk about Israel. And so, yeah, if Iran gains an even more of a toehold in Syria and continues to threaten Israel, both through its own military, but also through an array of proxy forces, including highly capable group like Lebanese Hezbollah, but also Shia militias in Iraq. Look, the Israelis are highly capable. They haven't shied away from using force in a number of countries. I mean, there was, the end of August, where there was a couple of attacks, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, where they went after them. So I'm of the mind that the Israelis can take care of themselves quite well, and always have been able to. And frankly, I think the Israelis probably have far better intelligence than we do in the region. And so I wouldn't be too worried about the Israelis. I think the Iranians are, they're becoming more aggressive, clearly, but at the same time, there is this element of deterrence in the region. It's been very kind of, operating what we would call the gray zone, and this kind of tit for tat, but escalation dynamics have remained kind of, I think, in calibration, in my own opinion.
Good. Let's go right back here.
Hi. How much of a stretch would you say it is to consider this to be the most sweeping reconfiguration of geopolitical power in the Middle East since Sykes-Picot? And a second question, if you wouldn't mind. What should be the disposition of the Trump administration toward Kurdish political refugees now who are being dragged from their cars and shot?
So you dropped the Sykes-Picot reference.
You dropped Sykes-Picot. So that wasn't big enough, but there you go.
That's the real deal. Okay, so I actually wrote a piece with Aryan Tabatabai in Foreign Affairs maybe 6 months ago, and Ari just spoke here at FPRI last week. She's an Iran expert, where we posed that exact question: is this major realignment in the Middle East, right, with Turkey, Russia, and Iran? And essentially, we concluded yes. The kind of geopolitical tectonic shifts that we're seeing now are major. Yeah, to go back to Sykes-Picot, I mean, you just gave me a homework assignment, right? I'd have to go back and really think long and hard about that. I'm also not a fearmonger, right? And I don't want to be the guy that's saying the sky is always falling. It's one of the things I talk about in the book with respect to the Islamic State, right? I say, look, terrorism's a really bad thing, but it's not an existential threat. I teach college students that are 18, 19 years old that when I say Cold War, they look at me like, the what? Like life for them began on 9/11, and they don't know anything before that. And so I think back to the prospect of nuclear war with the Soviets and think, okay, this is manageable, right? So when you get that question, I often get the question. It's like, what keeps you up at night? Mm-hmm. I mean, last month it was a crying baby, but most nights, that's literal. That's not just a joke.
No, that's the truth, right?
My wife will attest to that.
Someday it'll be a teenager. But
yeah, God. But I think, we have to keep things in perspective, right? And say there are these bigger threats on the horizon, a rising China or revanchist Russia, like the prospect of major power war, right? So think about how bad things were at some point and like, okay, this is a manageable threat. Everything we see today is not always the worst thing ever. To your second question was on Kurdish refugees. I think I read something just before. And again, I often have to, when I read something or see something, especially coming out of the White House, I have to kind of confirm that it's real. Like, for example, the letter, when I first saw the letter that President Trump wrote to Erdogan, I, like many other people, probably thought that was not real whatsoever, right? I'm like, that's funny, where's that from? And then you kind of are horrified when you're like, no, that's real. The thing I saw today was that he was urging Kurds to move to a different part of Syria. And so, I mean, you don't just, that's like saying to people from Philadelphia, like, it's okay, just move to New York, right? And it's just like,
you're practically the same people.
Yeah, right, because you're from the Northeast. And it's like, no, we actually, we may have some things in common, but like, no, this is my homeland. There's a culture, a history. We've lived here for centuries. So I think there's a level of naivete in saying these things. But no, I think the refugee issue is a major one, and that's not even including the Syrians from Turkey that are going to have to come back, into Syria, and where are they going to be resettled? And if they're resettled in a Kurdish area and they're Syrian Arabs, you're sowing the seeds for major ethnic conflict, right? This is the Middle East. This is what the Middle East does. But we're kind of perpetuating that for likely for decades.
Depressing thought. Yes, right here.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. Well, we got 20 more minutes. There's no telling how much more depressing we can get.
That's promise. Right.
Colin, one of the characterizations of the president is that he views everything transactionally. Mm-hmm. With this precipitous abandonment of the Kurds and the resulting lack of trust that will probably ensue, has he, in your opinion, simply created a transactional environment for all future alliances in which the United States may enter?
I really hope not, and I think that even our partners in the region realize that this is not what the United States is about. This is not what we do as a country, and so I'm hoping that this is something that, if there's a change of administration, that people will have newfound faith and say no. And I'm a big believer in mill-to-mill context, right? Military to military. So I think, SF guys that were over there fighting with the Kurds are going to maintain those relationships. They know, what the score is, even if hopefully they understand that this is politics, right? It's ugly politics and it's divisive. But yeah, I think it's going to be very detrimental to our ability to, build alliances in that region. And moreover, they're going to look for other partners, right? And they're going to find other partners. And so when we're ready to come back to the table, we may be sitting there alone. And that to me, again, as someone that teaches grand strategy, is the most troubling of all. Military hardware, we've got that for days, but it's the alliances that's going to get us through, really difficult times in that region.
Let's go. Let's go right up here to the front here. That's another part of the room. There's the microphone.
Hi, it's a tangential question, but it's about the Hezbollah.
I love those.
How would you characterize the Hezbollah's areas of focus and their strength as an organization now?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate on how much Hezbollah has actually suffered from participation in the Syrian conflict. I've written several pieces on it in a number of outlets, and I've kind of tracked that because I think it's ebbed and flowed over time. At one point, Hezbollah was suffering pretty major casualties, and we know that they dropped the recruiting age to, I think, as low as 15, and they run summer camps and things like that because they were sustaining such significant losses in Syria. But I think that if I were to assess the situation now, I think they're doing quite well, actually. The number that the Iranians give them in terms of money per year was declassified last year, and Nathan Sales mentioned it at an event that Matt Levitt hosted at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I think it was $700 million per year. So more than enough for a rainy day fund if you're a non-state actor. We know that they're highly sophisticated in their use of emerging technologies, including drones. And so, look, Hezbollah is a fact of life. They have a seat in the health ministry, right? They're a true hybrid threat where they're a non-state actor that's essentially an army. And they're also involved in politics.
Well, that reminds me of a question I was curious about, is that before IS, people would talk about Hezbollah as this unique force that had gone from being an extremist group to becoming a social services organization, a political party, an army.
They have a construction company.
A
Jihad
construction
al-Bina,
company, yeah.
You know what I mean?
And
it's like,
did Baghdadi and the people who formed IS, did they look to Hezbollah, even though in any ways as a model for this transition from being an extremist organization to being a political actor?
So I think in some ways they emulated Hezbollah in terms of governance, right? In terms of the ability to provide services, right? So when we look at, or when we think about Islamic State propaganda, unfortunately we focus on what comes on the nightly news in this country, which is beheadings, right? Which is the Jordanian pilot being burned alive in a cage, which is all this violence and gore. But actually the lion's share of their propaganda was positive. It was about families fishing by the river and kids going to school. It was amazing. I mean, Rukmini Callimachi from the New York Times has written about some of these efforts in terms of cracking down on corruption, right? And they actually did a great job and gained political legitimacy within the caliphate from the people. But in terms of actually ever entering into anything that we would recognize as politics, no, I don't think so. I don't think that any country would ever even seriously consider recognizing IS in its current form. That if you go back to the Taliban, there were 3 countries pre-9/11 that actually had recognized the Taliban. If I'm not mistaken, it was Saudi, UAE, and Pakistan, right? I do think that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, is closer to the Hezbollah model now because they are working at a grassroots level to establish local political councils. And I would defer to my colleague Charles Lister on this because he's a real expert in this area. But I see them now kind of going down that path of hybrid entity. Militia, political party, and in some kind of post-conflict negotiation in Syria, they very well may have a voice. And that gives you the potential for longevity, right? That we've seen in Hezbollah. We just had the 30-year anniversary, I think, or was it 40-year anniversary?
I was going to say of the attack on the U.S. barracks.
So,
that's
they've been
36
around
years
for a
ago.
long time, 1983.
Right. It's been a long time. Let's go right here. The microphone will come to you.
Thank you. I realize that Turkey is important to the United States as strategically, militarily, but how can the U.S. maintain its relationship with Turkey as a NATO member going forward, after all that's transpired in the last few weeks?
I ask myself that on a daily basis. I asked myself that when they started looking to buy the S-400 system from the Russians, right? I mean, that was kind of when everyone was like, huh? A NATO ally? And then when they were kicked out of the F-35 program, I asked myself that again. And I don't know is the answer, right? I would never tell my students that, so hopefully they don't watch this video. They think I have all the answers. But I don't know what the end game is for Erdogan, particularly as he moves closer into this orbit with Putin and Assad. Frankly, I'm not sure. I mean, you probably saw the couple of pieces in the papers this week about him coveting a nuclear weapon. You want to talk about existential threat? How about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East? Or frankly, anywhere for that matter. That's existential.
I mean, the idea that we need to remember, in the same way that as we try to understand our own politics, as complicated as they are, that politics in other countries is complicated too, and that not everybody's acting based on any long-term strategy. Some people are making it up as they go along, too.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I thought it might. Let's go right here to the front. The microphone will come to you, sir. Right, keep your hand up so the young man can see you. Actually, in front of him, right here. Yes, and then behind you. Go ahead.
To back up a little bit, it appeared at one point that we had a chance to carve out a different relationship with Iran. And we obviously don't have that opportunity now. What impact has that had on this whole process?
So are you referring specifically to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, or kind of the bilateral relationship more broadly?
Yeah, the bilateral relationship generally.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely night and day between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. There's something to be said that maybe the Obama administration was a bit too soft, right, on Iran. But what we see now is maybe an overcorrection. It's easy for me to sit up here and Monday morning quarterback it. I think the Iranians, we've struggled to understand them since the revolution and probably before that. So, the whole maximum pressure campaign, I had a piece in Foreign Policy last week where we basically say it's not working, right? Because the Iranians seem to be stringing together a series of victories. We're not. And so I think some kind of rapprochement with Iran is ideal. I just don't know if it's inevitable. And so I think, we are on the wrong track with Iran because look at this summer, the tanker wars, right? We just really can't quite get inside of their decision-making cycle. And if you look at the potential for escalation there, and I'll just go back to the comment on Turkey coveting a nuclear weapon. I mean, once that cat's out of the bag, I think the Iranians are well placed to kind of go down that road and go down it quite aggressively.
And if I could just sound depressing on another aspect, is
this whole talk is
right now,
depressing.
today, as we sit, right, there are roughly 4 dozen nuclear weapons in Turkey. They happen to be at an American Air Force base, but they are in Turkey. So
for sure,
that's an exciting thought too.
That's
Yes,
the
sir.
parenthetical and an important one.
Sir.
Why do you think the Obama administration pivoted away from the older allies in the Gulf, that is the Saudis, the Israelis, and a NATO ally since 1952, the Turks, and turned toward Iran? And do you think it might be because there was a perception that Erdogan might be trying to Ottomanize Syria?
Yeah, there's I think an element of that, and that's something, right, as Erdogan positions himself or sees himself as this kind of modern day caliph in some respects. Why did they pivot away from the Saudis? They're not great allies, and that's my take. So, they're not. Let's just be honest. Let's put it out there. 15 of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi. Let's not forget that. They brutally murdered Jamal Khashoggi, right? MBS is not this. He went on this massive PR offensive in the States, and a lot of people bought it, hook, line, and sinker. But now we know MBS, standing for Mr. Bonesaw, right? Something completely different. So no, this is serious stuff. They're not a good ally. So why? I don't lose any sleep. I don't shed any tears over a rift with the Saudis. But I do question, why there was. I think the Iran thing was maybe a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was, we want to get close to them, so we're going to hell or high water, and maybe we kind of ignored some of the red flags along the way. Look, again, it's a difficult relationship to navigate. It's not, but I think we have to be more nuanced and to say, again, this is, we're at war with them or they're our best friend, right? We can contain Iran. What happened to all these elements that were at play during the Cold War? So I think we've got to have a kind of more holistic approach to the way that we deal with a country like Iran, because if you remember after 9/11, there were some areas of cooperation against the Taliban, right? And so we can look for those areas to kind of, I think, look for confidence building measures and build some kind of trust. Say that again?
There have been no Iranians terrorists in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, we could probably spend the entire night talking just about, Iran and the United States.
I mean, there is the question about, if you could argue that the Obama administration had pivoted away from these traditional allies, that the Trump administration has pivoted, aggressively toward these allies.
Blank check
to the Soviets, blank check to the Turks. And how, I won't ask you to take any position on the administration per se, but how would it look if that kind of strategy worked? I mean, what is it that's supposed to come from suddenly offering a blank check to the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Turks to let them do what they want? And is this supposed to make things better, and how?
Maybe it's supposed to be the entry point for us to sneak out the back door and to kind of offload responsibility in that region. But again, look at the Saudis. Let's use for an example, the attack on the oil facilities, right? Saudi oil facilities were attacked. First came out, it was the Houthis in Yemen. Then it came out, it looked like this actually might have been, launched from Iran. What was the next thing that you heard about? Everyone saying in the papers, the Saudis can't wait to see what the Americans are going to do in response. And I said, wait a minute, we weren't attacked. Why would we fight for the Saudis? I mean, we sell them all the weapons. We have to pull the trigger for them too. So they're a great force on paper, but they don't fight. And so that whole strategy of kind of offloading to the Saudis and other kind of militaries that buy a lot of hardware, but I'm not sure that they know how to use it, I'd be very wary of that, actually.
That's fair. Let's go in the back here. Yes, right here, microphone right there.
I've been puzzled by the alignment between Russia and Iran. Russia has its own Islamist groups, and Iran has its own radical vision. Is it that the Russian Muslims are Sunni and they don't think that Iran has much appeal, or they just have bigger fish to fry and they have more in common than they have that divides them?
I think that's probably a part of it, right? The Sunni-Shia difference. If you look at kind of the wars in Chechnya and Dagestan and kind of the greater Caucasus, they were, Sunni jihadists. I think the other part is when we talk about, a relationship between Iran and Russia, this doesn't have to be, it's probably more of a marriage of convenience than an actual marriage, right? So the stars are in alignment right now, but make no mistake, if Russia finds a more attractive partner, they're going to leave the Iranians high and dry, or vice versa. So I think, ideologically, they come from very different places. And so, politics make for strange bedfellows. International politics probably make for even stranger bedfellows.
Indeed.
And I think a lot of it's probably personality driven. So if we do see a change of leadership, which I wouldn't hold my breath for in Russia or Iran, you could see a kind of another shift. For me, Turkey's the real wild card, right? Because this is one, again, as you mentioned, this is a NATO ally. So I think we had a certain degree of confidence that Turkey would kind of act in accordance, and really they haven't.
Mm-hmm. And that is the interesting thing is both the Turks and the Iranians, they have in common that they want influence in the Middle East, and neither one of them is an Arab state.
Right. Yeah.
And
That's a
so
great
they're
point.
coming at it. They're coming at it from different historical perspectives as well.
Very different, very proud people, very rich, long histories, right, of empires of their own. And I think, and I mentioned to you on the cab ride over here,
Right.
I wish more people would study history, because how do you go about trying to figure out the Middle East if you don't even have a grasp of the last 150 years, if not much longer? And so even as, a scholar and academic, it's something I'm pushing myself to look at more of now, is this kind of history of where we got to in that region.
Okay. Another question from the audience? I'm going to turn, as we get close to the end, I want to ask you, because you did mention in the conversation earlier and at the end of the book, where you talk about this idea that IS is not an existential threat. And we can debate meanings about that.
Sure.
But what would successful policy, like we're talking about a threat that is sort of chronic but not existential, that could potentially create significant problems, but is also not something we can solve from today to tomorrow. What does an effective long-term strategy against a threat like that look like?
So I think there's gradations, and I also think kind of this is one of those things where you sit is where you stand, right? So if you're sitting in Paris or Brussels or London, you're primarily concerned with a couple of things. One, preventing attacks like we saw in Paris in November 2015, Brussels March 2016, and other places. So IS was innovative in the sense of there was directed attacks, right? So people that came to the Caliphate, got trained up, and then returned home, right, to launch an attack. That was Paris. There's virtual, right, virtual planner model, where they're communicating with people over encrypted channels saying, hey, here's all you have to do. Go and get this kind of a weapon, shoot up this kind of a target. And then there's inspired. This is people that are sitting at their homes, right, and they're consuming propaganda, and then they, without having any contact, they make some kind of a martyrdom tape, they pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and they go out and they stab a policeman, or they try to shoot up a cafe. So I think, one, it's preventing the ability of a group to launch what I would call spectacular attacks, right, major external operations. That's one. The second is, so that's kind of the defensive. Right. The other is, look at the sheer numbers of Europeans that went over to join the Caliphate. Clearly people are disenfranchised. So how do you grow up in Paris, right? And if whoever's been to Paris, it's an amazing city. How do you grow up in Paris and think, no, I'd much rather be in Raqqa, Syria, under aerial bombardment, right? So something's gone wrong along the way where folks from, second and third generation Moroccans or, Tunisians or whatever haven't been properly assimilated into European society. And I think the United States does a much better job there with our Muslim community. So I think it's figuring out, how not to let a group like that manifest, but also figuring out how not to provide the foot soldiers for the next kind of transnational terrorist group. That's unnerving if you look at the amount of Europeans that went over there to fight.
And of course, this is, we know from the discussion about the reaction to the Turks when sanctions were threatened against Turkey, Erdogan suggested that he will open the gates and allow more refugees back into Europe. And even the president has thrown up his hands and said that's the Europeans' problem. Yeah. But this will, of course, precisely raise this question of you have people who've already been radicalized, and now they're going to go home, and they're going to be unhappy or will be viewed with suspicion. And
so let's talk about the second and third order effects very briefly of that. And we saw it in 2015 and 2016, and I think there's a lag effect to this stuff. We still haven't seen the complete manifestation. But if you think about what those attacks did, right, and the kind of reaction against jihadi groups, right, and then migrants coming from Syria, coming from Iraq, coming from elsewhere that are conflated with jihadists, it has fueled the rise of violent white supremacism and radical right-wing extremism in Europe. And we see that both at a political level, but also if you look at the kind of resurgence of neo-Nazis. And so, right, if you think about these refugees, they've been victimized twice. Once by ISIS, where they've had to flee their countries, and now to the place where they get, right, they're being greeted by, if you want to call it a greeting, people that want to kill them. Not all Europeans, right? Most are welcoming, but there is this kind of uptick in right-wing extremism that's almost a direct relation. There's a lot of factors, but that's a major one, is the migrant issue.
which, of course, we'll have to have another show and have you back to talk about, because I'm afraid that we are just about out of time on that rather grim but important note. So thanks, Colin Clarke, for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
FPRI would like to especially thank the National Liberty Museum for hosting us tonight and the Stanley and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation for their support for this program. Our conversation tonight is unfortunately coming to an end, but the conversation continues at FPRI. It continues on Geopolitics with Granieri and with our other programs at FPRI. So if you want to keep up with future programs of Geopolitics with Granieri or other programs at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our iTunes and YouTube channels. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, especially the omnicompetent staff of PWP Video and my FPRI colleagues who produce this broadcast, Eli Gilman, Michelle Reese, and Jessica Taylor, I'm Ron Granieri. Good night. Thanks for joining us.